Lateral violence literally means doing violence to somebody who's beside you. It refers to doing something to harm somebody who's part of your same group, whether it be your group in a workplace, your ethnic group, or some group that somehow binds you together so that you feel a sense of belonging. And within that particular group, sometimes people do very harmful things to one another. Specifically, this is the case among groups that are oppressed. So sometimes they can't do anything around the bigger structures that hold them down, and they take out their frustrations on people who are close to them in some way with disastrous results. I'm going to tell you a few stories, and then we'll get into ways in which we can understand this phenomenon at a deeper level. So think about this man who lived on a reserve, saved his money, bought an RV vehicle, and turned it into a native fast food place so he would serve things like Bannock burgers. He started to really prosper, and then people started talking. Who does he think he is? And before you knew it, they had sprayed graffiti on his RV vehicle, and after a while somebody set fire to it and his whole dream vanished. And this was brought on by people of his own group. Or think about this chief who had been sober for years, and his former drinking partners took him and held him down, and one of them forced a funnel into his mouth, and somebody else poured alcohol into the funnel to force him to ingest alcohol. So these are instances of people from one's own community doing something harmful. Now, a lot of times it's not as dramatic as that. Lateral violence can take the form of innuendo, gossip, planting a seed of distrust, doing something so that negative, so that you get the job instead of the next person, and so on. So let's look more deeply into this phenomenon. So it starts with this understanding that we often want what others have. And we then move from that to say, oh, we have a right to have the same things they do. And then lateral violence then, in the light of this, can be seen as, if we cannot have what the other has and we want, then we don't want the others to have it as well, and then we will do whatever it takes to get for ourselves what the other has, or to be sure that it is taken away from them. So this is at the heart of what lateral violence is. So let's look at these concepts a little more closely. Mimesis is a Greek word that René Girard has really built on to develop a theory of the origins of violence. So think of it. We learn all language and culture mimetically. We learn to imitate people who speak a language, and by imitating them, we learn to speak well a particular language. So mimesis among animals works at the level of behavior. You just have to throw a bit of food out, and one seagull starts moving toward that food, and before you know it, all the other seagulls follow that one seagull. But what Girard has pointed out is that we as humans are far more mimetic than animals, and we tend to imitate the inside of others. We intend to imitate the desires of others. So we want what the other person wants. So it works something like this. The self, I myself, might perceive that the next person desires something. They seem to be after something. I can start saying, oh, I could do with that myself, and I start to desire the same object, but not because of anything about the object, it's because the other person wants it. So if the other person gets in the way, then in Girard's terms, the other becomes a model obstacle, a model that I'm following and imitating, and an obstacle because I can't have that. Now this becomes more intense under certain circumstances. If the object is really valuable, mimetic desire goes up. If the model is really prestigious, and this is what we see in advertising, a prestigious model, somebody who got a gold medal at the Olympics, for instance, if that person wears a certain kind of running shoes, then other people will want the same things. However, what's really significant is that this goes up within a closed relational system. That is, if the same people are interacting together all the time, they tend to have more of this mimetic desire, and if they relate closely to one another, it goes up even more. So there are these different levels of intensity around this. If, in Girard's terms, there's an external model, there's somebody who's way up there in comparison to us, they serve as a role model to us, and we don't really think we can be as good as they. But if they are really at our level, then we can really imagine having the same thing, and we can start to justify this because we feel we're entitled to the same thing, and this becomes internal mimetic desire. And this then can lead to a rivalry. So the self and the other both want what the other has, and this goes back and forth, and the rivalries can become really intense. And at a very intense level, there is what Girard calls doubling, where people are just simply preoccupied with the other, obsessed, if you like, and this leads to emotional dependency. Now, when we think about justice, the key root ideas behind justice are balance, because we even see these statues of this woman holding a balance. So justice means that things are in balance, but they're in balance according to rules of rightness, or a sense of rightness, or a sense of values that determine on what basis things should be balanced. And then if things are balanced according to the rules of rightness, then we say things are fair. So if we keep that in mind, often we are motivated out of a sense of justice or injustice, but we don't really think things through. This is sort of woven into the core of who we are, a certain sense of justice, and so it works at the tacit level. So tacit means we can't quite put it into words, but we have this feeling, this sense of what justice is all about. And often two sides who are in conflict each will think that what they are doing is the right thing because they have their own sense of justice that lies behind the judgments that they're making. So we have this strong emotional reaction if there is an injustice, and we tend to act on these emotions. So where do we get these rules of rightness? We get them through experience. We get them through the things our parents taught us. In traditional societies that have a history that goes way back, where the culture is deeply embedded, this sense of rightness and fairness comes from traditional teachings. For some people, they get these ideas from religion, and for others, they look to law as a sense of, oh, this helps to define what we think is right and just and fair. We're constantly making comparisons with other people. And we could ask the question, what are our values and what are the values of the other people? Are we at least working on the same values? And we could also ask the question, who even determines what is fair? And if we don't bring it to somebody else to determine for us, then we work on our own basis of what to us would seem to be fair, even though we haven't talked about it to the other person who's weighing the balance with other things that are important to them. So getting back to where we started, lateral violence can be seen as if we cannot have what the other person has and wants, then we don't want them to have it. We're going to do everything we can to get it. And if we can't, we want to be sure that the other person can't have it either. So we're going to bring that person down. If somebody starts getting ahead of where we are, we'll pull them down so that we're at the same level. So now, if you're watching this together with somebody else or in a group, you could have a conversation. So think about examples of when you have been the victim of lateral violence. How did it feel? What was it like for you? Think of examples when you have participated in lateral violence or you've observed it, haven't done anything about it, but how did you justify what you did? Or if you were observing it, how did the people who engaged in lateral violence justify it? So talk about that. You can pause this and talk about it and resume the video once you've finished your discussion. Now, another way of looking at lateral violence is that it could take the form of scapegoating. So we're going to talk about scapegoating, how it starts with a crisis. We're going to look at what the victim is like, and then we're going to relate scapegoating to lateral violence. So scapegoating takes place when we're frustrated. We really would like to blame somebody, and the scapegoat idea is when a number of people are frustrated and they come together and they pour their violence, if you like, onto the same victim, and they feel somehow bonded together when that happens. The effects of scapegoating, because people can sort of be brought together in a peaceful relationship by having a common enemy, if you like, but the effect doesn't last that long. So one way of putting it, drawing on René Girard again, is that things start with a crisis when things seem to be falling apart. There's a kind of chaos, or people feel like their situation is declining. And it could be that everybody could fight with everybody else, and then things would really go downhill, and the community could really disintegrate. So when we think about a scapegoat, who is the scapegoat generally? Well, the scapegoat has done something that the community feels is wrong, and it's on the basis of somehow saying the scapegoat is illegitimate, that all of this violence is justified. A scapegoat is usually somebody who's different, potentially kind of part of the community, but also kind of different. So when I talked about this at the Aboriginal Nurses Association, Aboriginal nurses said, we see that happening to us. We're Indigenous, but we're in another community that's not our community, so we fall into that category of being kind of the same, but yet different in a certain way. Scapegoats are powerful enough to blame for whatever is going wrong, but they also are not too powerful, otherwise they could really fight back. So they're powerful yet vulnerable, and they're in a context of blame. Scapegoat action, traditionally in archaic societies, Girard has studied many of these, but you find this phenomenon of stoning. It's talked about in the Hebrew Bible, for instance, but stoning is the whole community gathered together to kill somebody by everybody throwing stones, for instance. So that's how it was initially, and there were different forms of doing this. In our society, we can have the same kind of structure of scapegoat action, everybody turning against a scapegoat, but we can do it with less and less overt violence. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're lynching somebody, but we could try to get somebody out of our community in some way or another, by banishing them, by even emotionally banishing them, by turning on them in some way. Sometimes this is well planned and it's systematic. Sometimes it just happens spontaneously. Sometimes this kind of action happens over time. Sometimes it's immediate. But it's always hidden to the community. The community does not say, oh, we're going to scapegoat somebody and that's how we're going to come together. It's sort of a hidden process, and they think they're justified in doing this to the victim. And they might even frame it that justice is done at the end. So after scapegoating, things are nice and orderly, things are together, and people are so nice to one another they're almost afraid to raise any issues. And again, this doesn't last too long. So how does it relate to lateral violence? Well, groups of people will take out their frustrations on a victim who is from their group yet distinctive. In this example of the chief who was forced to drink alcohol, we had a group of people who were brought together, and they will have had this idea: who does the chief think he is? He's not drinking anymore. Does he think he's better than we are? And they would, in their own minds, kind of justify what they did. And they are then united through this action, and they all think that what they did is justified. So have another conversation. Have you ever been the victim of scapegoating? And again, think about what it felt like. Have you witnessed this happening? And here's another question. In my experience with scapegoating, it's like a snowball that you can hardly stop. And so it raises this big question. If people are starting to move in this direction and there is this kind of conversation within the community, who does that person think they are? How do you stop that? How can you nip it in the bud, so to speak, and how can you prevent it? And one clue might be, if there are teachings around this and people start to become aware of this, you can draw on that and say, hold on, wait a minute. Is what is really going on here a tendency to scapegoat? So After your conversation about that, let's move on to identity needs and look at lateral violence from this perspective. As I've worked on this notion of identity needs, I've come up with these 5 interconnected needs, and you can see that they are all linked to the core of the self. So somehow or other, identity needs are things that are so woven into who we are that they connect deeply with our emotions, and they start to identify the sorts of things that are of greatest importance to us. If we think about what are we willing to die for, or what are we willing to be violent for, or stand up for, or fight for, chances are whatever we answer is going to be somehow or other relate to these identity needs. So let's look at them briefly one by one. We all have a need for meaning, to make sense of the world around us, to have a world of meaning that helps us position who we are in relation to the world. In terms of moral psychologists like Hauser and Haidt, we have these categories about what is forbidden, what is permitted, what is obligatory, and these are really deeply held values that we have around these 3 categories. So that's another way of looking at our meaning system, and that leads then to this idea that our world of meaning tells us about our own sense of justice and injustice, and sometimes this all takes the form of an identity narrative, a story about our people or ourselves that helps to show what's really important to and makes us stand out as a particular community or as individuals. We also have this need to connect with people and to be with people who talk our language in terms of these people have been through the same experience. They understand what we're going through. So we can be bonded with them, and we develop a sense of mutual empathy, and we feel kind of belonging. Now, one of the most important aspects of who we are is our capacity to imagine something and to take action, to do something creative, to initiate something that changes the world in some way or another. Now, action, as Paul Ricoeur points out, involves an actor who does something and a sufferer who is acted upon. So as we start to look at our relationships and who we are in relation to one another, we can say at any point, who is really taking action, who is imagining something and carrying it out, and who is acted upon. And we see this when we think about dominant structures, which we're going to get to, but if there are bigger powers that are always telling us what to do or constraining our action, we really feel acted upon. Part of this is that we want to be able to change our physical and social environment. So if you think about people being put into townships as they were in South Africa under apartheid, or onto reserves or reservations, you can see somebody else acting upon them and putting them into an environment where they have limited control over how they can change what's going on. They're into these fixed environments. Another way of thinking about action is to say, I can be the author of my own destiny. Kelvin Halen has looked at the matter of economic dependency, and so when we get into long-term dependent relationships, our actions become dependent on others, and we are acted upon in an ongoing way, and we lose that spark of being able to do something ourselves, and it's always a challenge to reverse this whole tendency. We also have a need for security, physical, emotional, spiritual, economic. We don't want to feel like there are vital threats that call into question our ongoing existence or capacity to thrive in any of these areas. And finally, we have a need for recognition. We need to have a sense that we are worth something. We need affirmation, validation. Francis Fukuyama has looked at the ancient idea of thumos, a Greek word that means this need for dignity, for recognition, for a sense of importance. So we also need recognition for our own meaning, connection, and actions, for our own community, if you like. When any of these are threatened, there are emotional implications ranging from anger if there's an injustice, to sadness if we lose a connection, to fear if our security is threatened, depression if we can't take action, and shame if we get negative recognition, if somebody puts us down or says that we don't amount to much. So if we link this to mimetic theory, a lot of times mimetic rivalry are for the being or the self. We see somebody else who exudes positive emotions and we say, I want to be like them. And we link this with the object that seems to bring them pleasure. The core of the self, which brings together mind, body, emotions, and spirit, can be linked to this. And so sometimes we really want to have the whole life situation of the other person, and we have mimetic desire for that. And then we can start to think that the need satisfiers for identity needs can be objects of mimetic desire. Along with this, we have to take note that there are emotional memories. If we get traumatized or if there's a major attack on our well-being, and we have these reservoirs of recollection, so we can have a whole lot of memories that are sort of stored in our limbic system. And when there's a certain trigger, all of these memories come back. And our brain does not connect our emotional side with time. So if we have a trigger that brings back these memories, it's as though these things that happened 20 years ago, but you have the feeling that they're happening again right now. And when these get really deeply entrenched, we have trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. But a key thing about all of this is that we tend, as we constitute our memories, we really maximize the hurts that were done to us. We maximize our own victimization, and we really downplay our own role in violence. I didn't intend to do that much damage, kind of thing. And so when we think about justice then, we have an inflated sense of our own victimization and a deflated sense of what we've done to others. So if we think about what satisfies our identity needs, some of these things are, some people look to money or friends or concrete things to satisfy them. Some look to power, and some people build this false sense. You know, I've had the experience of letting myself, I build an identity around my position within an institution, and that's really kind of a false self. And when I've had to leave that position, then all of a sudden I have this huge crisis because I built my identity around this, and so it hits me really, really hard. And so it's a wise thing to not let that happen. We can also observe that non-zero-sum satisfiers can be good for everybody. So if we think about money is zero-sum. If one person has it, the other person doesn't have it. But things like information, things like joy, things like goodwill, things like working toward a goal like providing for children, these sorts of things are open-ended, and nobody loses if we get these things. So strategically, if we can find satisfiers that are broad and can enhance everybody's well-being, we're better off. So we can find satisfiers then in our spirituality and our empathy, and we can even say we really feel satisfied at the core of who we are if we contribute to empowering somebody else. So let's look at identity needs then in lateral violence. Those who are engaged in lateral violence often have something really missing in their lives. They may not have healthy relationships. They may have had their meaning system somehow compromised. They really might need recognition or satisfaction. Maybe they themselves have been put down a whole lot. And the victims of lateral violence seem to have more of everything. So here's a story. Here's a young woman in a First Nations community, and she's good looking. She studies hard. She applies herself. She seems to be doing really, really well and has these ambitions to make a difference in the world, go on to university. And her peers, other young women, say, oh, who does she think she is? And they take her in the dark to a secluded place, and they hold her down, and they cut up her face and other parts of her, and she's absolutely emotionally devastated. She has scars that take away her good looks, and it has such an impact on her, she ends up leaving her community, going to a city, and engaging in prostitution. So this is an extreme version of lateral violence, but you start to see how it can be motivated and the terrible effects of it. Sometimes people have a sense of entitlement to a certain need satisfaction, and they think they're really great, or they should be having what other people have, and so that moves them into a position where they engage in lateral violence. So you can have another conversation. Pause this if you like and talk about these questions. Which need categories are most important to you? Which need categories are most important to your community? When there is lateral violence, what is it that people are really after based on what you've observed or experienced? Now we can look at lateral violence from the point of view of hegemonic structures, and we'll look at these 4 topics. Hegemonic structure is one in which there's a dominant group and a subjected group, and the dominant group has more political rights and uses the political system, if you like, to dominate others. There's a physical side to it. There's a kind of dominating spirit or energy. There are economic interests that favor the dominant, and identity and language figure into this. So if you look at colonialism, colonial powers has a dominant group that basically sets everything up so that they benefit the most. The dominant set the agenda, they make the rules, they get the benefits, and they do things to perpetuate their own ongoing dominance, if you like. So this could be a subgroup within a society. In African countries, in Kenya, for instance, once their president is elected from a particular ethnic group, the proverb is, now it's our turn to suck. And so everything is done so that this particular ethnic group continues to have a president who continues to support that particular tribe in a particular way. So when we think about hegemonic domination, we start to see that this can be internalized. So after a period of time, a subjected group start to say, we really, really are inferior, and they start looking up to the dominant group. They are deferential, and they can't bring themselves to do anything to stand up to the group that has been dominating them. So their relative positions become part of their identity, and these can be based on race, class, gender, or kinship group. So if we think about gender, for years and years, the European-based culture really elevated men, and women accepted their place as somehow being less important. In a lot of traditional societies, there was more of a matriarchal kind of value system, and women had a much more significant role to play. So, but at a certain time, when the domination system starts to fall apart, the people who were on top feel really, really threatened when somebody who they thought was inferior start to do things that were what they traditionally did. So in male-dominated kinds of professions like the police and firefighters, you've seen lots of harassment of women as they've moved into policing jobs because the men have somehow felt threatened by having these, what they might have thought of as weaker people doing the same job as they have been doing. Now, what makes this really interesting then is that if you think about what we said about mimetic rivalries before, that people have the most intense mimetic rivalries with people that they identify with, we can start to see another way of understanding what's going on. So people who are dominant will have really intense rivalries with other dominant people. So in colonialism, the English were really in competition with the French and with the Spanish and so on. So the colonial powers were in rivalry with one another. The other side of the equation is that, that people who are oppressed or who are subjected tend to have really intense rivalries with other people who are also oppressed, part of their same group. So we're starting to see why lateral violence is so powerful among people who are oppressed. They're taking their frustrations out on the people beside them in their own group. At a time of liberation, when people start standing up to a dominant group, then of course we have rivalries between a formerly oppressed group and the dominant group. So there are these three different kinds of situation. So colonialism is a particular case of rivalries among dominant powers, rivalries among subjected groups, and lateral violence can be then seen that people within subjected groups take out their frustrations on one another. So let's have a conversation about this. Lateral violence tends to take place between members of the same group. Think about examples of lateral violence that you have observed. What was the relationship between those who perpetrated lateral violence and their victims? Were they at the same level? Did they identify with one another? Or how can this knowledge of hegemonic structures help to understand what went on? Now let's take an integral approach to understand this, and we're drawing on the thought of Ken Wilber. So Ken Wilber says that when you look at any phenomenon, you can use this particular scenario. So if you think about above the horizontal line, we're looking at the individual aspect of it. Below the line, we're looking at the collective. To the left, we're looking at what goes on inside people that can't be observed, and to the right, we're looking at the sorts of things that can be observed that are exterior. So if we think about victims, and we start with the upper left, the interior individual, people who are harmed experience trauma, and this manifests as a kind of woundedness, and a hermeneutical woundedness. Hermeneutics has to do with making sense of things, interpreting things. So all of a sudden, they can't make sense of their world anymore. Why did my friends turn on me? How can we make sense of that? And then there's emotional woundedness, spiritual woundedness, relational woundedness, and a deep woundedness of the self. What we can see on the exterior, and this is in extreme violence situations, we could see that loved ones might have been hurt, harmed, killed. Property might have been damaged. The security is not there anymore. People don't have the same capacity to do things. Their status has been damaged, or they might even be harmed bodily, as in the example of the young woman whose friends cut up her face. On the lower left, we see that there are threats to continuity, coherence, and the imagination, vitality, and capacity. So we see the effect of, if we think about colonialism as a form of violence, we can see that it had this effect on people who were subjected through colonialism. And at the collective side, we can similarly identify losses to members of communities. When we think about perpetrators, and again, looking at the interior individual, we see that they have a hermeneutics of justification. That means they have a way of justifying their actions. And sometimes they will have a form of justice. They remember historical things. We're getting even with what people did in the past, or whatever. They might say, we're inherently better than the others, or we have a right to what they have. There's a certain amount of emotional gratification that they feel, and certain fears if they don't join in, and so on. And we can observe the violent actions and how they get recognition for violence sometimes, and sometimes they even celebrate what they did to bring somebody else down. So when we think about lateral violence, we can think about at the interior, what are people going through inside when they engage in this? We can say, what are the behaviors of perpetrators, and what are the behaviors of victims? What does this do to the heart of the community, and how does lateral violence, in a sense, do something to the core of the dynamics of a community. Like I visited one group of First Nations, and they told me, it used to be that our doors were always unlocked, they were always open to people. If anybody came by at mealtime, they were always welcome, we'd always look after them. And they said, it's not like that anymore. Now we lock our doors. So you can see that because of violence within the community, it helped to shape the culture of the community as a whole. And it also raises the question then of what are the responses of a community as a community to lateral violence? So you can have another conversation and think about each of the quadrants now. What can be done to address the trauma of victims? What happens to them inside them? How can violent actions be halted or prevented? What is lateral violence doing to the core of the community? Is there a culture of lateral violence? Is it like a disease that spreads through the community? What systems can be put in place to address lateral violence? Looking at all four quadrants from upper left to lower right. So finally, we're going to look at reconciliation and blessing. And we'll look at these particular themes. Now, when I use the term blessing, I draw on the Hebrew word berakah, and it has all of these connotations of sustenance, well-being, creativity, things bubbling away, flourishing, that there's a respectfulness of life, that it brings a certain amount of joy, there's generosity, peace. So these things are associated with the concept of blessing. And I have this idea of mimetic structures of blessing. Mimetic in that they're imitative, and structures that they're that are patterns, and they go on, so that people are mutually empowering one another. If there is conflict, it's channeled into creativity and trying to do new things. There can even be a kind of competition that helps everybody do better. People in many respects are feeding one another. It tends to be more open. Dissent is welcome. People can speak their minds. They're not put down for it. And the dissent then leads to additional creativity. So we can think about reconciliation then as a movement to the right on our red line, where we move out of deep-rooted conflict, which is closed and acquisitive, to reconciliation, which tends to be inclusive and generative and generous. And when we think about reconciliation at the heart, if you think about the red diamond there, we have discursive and symbolic structures. That means we talk about things or do symbolic things, participate in rituals or in ceremonies that brings people together, and as a result we get these five things: a sense of justice, a new relationship, a change of structure, healing, and transcendence. So the discursive processes involve telling the truth, having dialogues, expressing, acknowledging our loss and woundedness, and then a response to that, a remorse, apology, willingness to make reparations, and we start to be open to mercy and forgiveness. To get there, we need to feel a certain amount of safety, freedom from threats, but it's really important to have a mandate. It's important to give somebody a mandate to move ahead on a reconciliation process and expand on the vision and give them the resources to do it. So communities wanting to address lateral violence can give somebody a mandate to say, what can you do about this? Can you engage the community in a dialogue to try to work this out so that we can change things? I call something called meta-requisites, things that surround this. And at the core of this are teachings of blessing. So within every culture, within every religion, within every civilization, if you like, there are teachings within the culture that are geared to get people to live together in a good way. So you can think about do unto others as you would like them to do to you. You can think about things coming from many different sources. You can think about stories of reconciliation or stories that help to establish positive values and positive relationships. When we think about the results, Transcendence can mean to get above the whole situation. You start to see multiple perspectives, or it can mean connecting to a higher power, if you like. It has multiple meanings, but it can have to do with a spiritual transformation, if you like. But you somehow get beyond it, because feelings of hatred and resentment can keep us down. They stifle our creativity. They make us negative, moody kinds of people. And they mean that, and it means that as communities we can't really move ahead. So we have to transcend those kinds of feelings. And as we do that, we develop new relationships. We start to change the structures if there are structures that keep certain people down. And as we start doing that, it leads to healing from our traumas. We start to feel like we're becoming whole once again. And if we do all of this really well, at the very end we say, there's a sense of balance and it seems right. We have a sense of justice. So you can have one last conversation. If there has been widespread lateral violence in your community, what is your vision for a reconciliation process? In which result area do you feel that change is most needed? And here you can think about building new relationships, changing the structure, which might have to do with changing laws, changing the language that is used, changing even the economic kind of relationships that exist. What kind of healing is needed, healing from trauma, and trauma and emotional hurt leads to physical changes that are challenging. What about a sense of justice? What would it mean in your situation to have a sense of balance and a sense of things are right? And what are the rules of rightness? What are the deep values that would guide that? And what about transcendence? So have your last conversation, and thank you very much for watching this and allowing me to share with you some of the insights that I've had as I've been invited to walk the path with various communities that have really struggled with lateral violence. And I wish you the richest blessings in the full sense of that term as you take certain actions individually and collectively to deal with lateral violence.